Now we start the exercises for probabilities, for the calculation of probabilities, and this exercise is specifically about the calculation of probabilities of different events or different outcomes. So starting with the example of cystic fibrosis, which is a human disease, and this disease is caused by mutation in CFTR gene, and this gene is cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. So mutation in this gene causes a disease which is cystic fibrosis, and the inheritance pattern of this disease is autosomal recessive, that it is inherited into humans in an autosomal recessive fashion. And there are two alleles for a specific mutation, the dominant allele and the recessive allele, because the pattern of inheritance is autosomal recessive, and this is biallelic trait. So there are two alleles, one is the dominant allele and the other one is recessive allele. The dominant allele is represented by convention by the capital letters, and the recessive alleles are represented by small letters by convention. So we are following the same basic convention of reporting the dominant and recessive alleles in genetics. So a cross of the homozygous dominant with the homozygous recessive produces the heterozygous offspring, which is a common conclusion for the autosomal recessive traits. So consider the cross of two heterozygous individuals. The expected genotype frequency is one individual for AA, which is the homozygous dominant genotype, two individuals with the heterozygous genotype, and one individual with the homozygous recessive genotype. So probabilities are, because there are total 4 of the expected genotype frequencies, so the probability for the homozygous dominant is 1 by 4, probability for heterozygous is 2 by 4, and probability for homozygous recessive is 1 by 4, and their answers are 0.25 for the homozygous dominant, 0.5 for the heterozygous, and 0.25 for the homozygous recessive. And the phenotypes are that the homozygous dominant, they are completely normal individuals. The heterozygous, although they don't have the disease, but they are termed as the carriers of the disease. And then the individuals who are homozygous for the recessive allele, so those individuals, they suffer from cystic fibrosis. So this is the scenario here. Now in the cross that we discussed in the previous slide, the cross of two heterozygous individuals with the genotype frequencies of 1, 2, 1. So we have different questions regarding that cross. So the first question is, what is the probability that first child is normal? The second question is, what is the probability that second child is carrier? The third question is, what is the probability that first two children suffer from cystic fibrosis? The fourth question is, what is the probability that second and third children are carriers? The fifth question is, what is the probability that first child is female carrier? And the sixth question is, what is the probability that a child is either normal or affected? Right? So these are the questions that we have, and all of these, they relate to the calculation of probability, either the simple probabilities or the compound probabilities. Now we are going to see the answers for these questions one by one. And our first question was, what is the probability that first child is normal? So probability of first child to be normal is probability of the homozygous dominant genotype, because remember that the completely normal individuals are those who have the homozygous dominant genotype, right? So this is the probability of the homozygous dominant genotype, and that probability, as you can remember from the first slide, is 0.25. So this is our answer, that probability for the first child to be normal is 0.25. So this is the answer to our question number 1. The second question is, what is the probability that second child is carrier? So probability of second child to be carrier. So do you remember that what is the probability for the carriers? The probability for carriers is the same, which is the probability for the heterozygous individuals, and that probability is 0.5. So our answer is probability for the second child to be carrier is 0.5. So this is our second question. Now the third question is, what is the probability that first two children have cystic fibrosis? So what is different here? In the previous two questions, we had simple probability calculations in which we were talking about a single outcome in a single event. But here what we are talking about a single outcome, but the events are two consecutive events. So we have two consecutive events, that is the first two children, and the outcome that we are talking about is one, which is cystic fibrosis. That what is the probability that first two children have cystic fibrosis? So what should we do here in case of compound probability? So we have to put down the probability of first two children to have cystic fibrosis as probability of first child to be homozygous multiplied by probability of second child to be homozygous recessive. Because the persons who suffer from the cystic fibrosis, they must have been homozygous for the autosomal recessive allele, right? Because this is an autosomal recessive disease. So those persons who are affected by cystic fibrosis, they must have the homozygous recessive genotype. So we have the individual probabilities of persons to be homozygous for their recessive allele. So we are going to multiply those individual probabilities because we are talking about two consecutive events. So probability of the homozygous recessive genotype into probability of homozygous recessive genotype, which is 0.25 multiplied by 0.25, and the answer is 0.0625. So we can say that probability of first two children to have cystic fibrosis is 0.0625. Now the next question is, what is the probability that second and third children are carrier? So is this a simple probability or a compound probability? So obviously we are talking about two consecutive events, so that is why it is a compound probability. And we are talking about a single type of the outcome, which is carrier. So probability of second and third children to be heterozygous, because carrier are those individuals, carriers are those individuals who are heterozygous. So probability of second child to be heterozygous and probability of third child to be heterozygous. So we take the individual probability of a child to be heterozygous, and because we are talking about two consecutive events, so we will multiply the individual probabilities of these two consecutive events. So probability of the heterozygous genotype into probability of heterozygous genotype. So this is 0.5 into 0.5, it is equal to 0.25. So the answer to this question is probability of second and third children to be carriers is 0.25, right? So the other question is, what is the probability that first child is female carrier? Now what is this? Is this a simple probability or a compound probability? Because here we are talking about only one event, that is first child. But still it is a compound probability because we are talking about two types of outcomes. One outcome is the gender of the child, and the other outcome is what? It is the genotype or the health status of that child. So what is the probability that first child is female carrier? So for that purpose, we will have to put the probability of female alone and the probability of heterozygous alone, and then we multiply these two probabilities because this is compound probability. So the probability of female means the probability of females, obviously. So probability of heterozygous means the probability of the heterozygous genotype. So what do we have here? The probability for female is 0.5 because the probability for males is 0.5 as well. So probability of female is 0.5, and what is the probability of heterozygous genotype? It is also 0.5. So the answer is 0.25. So we can state that probability of first child to be female carrier is 0.25. So this is our answer to this question. Now our last question is, what is the probability that a child is either normal or affected? So probability for a child to be either homozygous dominant or recessive. Why? Because the normal individuals are those who are homozygous dominant, and the affected individuals are those who are homozygous recessive. So we have to put down the probability of a child to be homozygous plus probability of a child to be homozygous recessive. Now again, we are talking about the compound probability, but in this case we are taking the sum of these individual probabilities. And why is that so? Because we are talking about a single event, and the outcomes, although the outcomes are two, but both of these outcomes are of the same type, that we are talking about the genotype of individuals. So that is why we are going to take the sum of these individual probabilities. So the probability for a child to be homozygous dominant is the probability of the homozygous dominant genotype, and probability of a child to be homozygous recessive is the probability of the homozygous recessive genotype. So what are these respective probabilities? This is 0.25 plus 0.25 equals 0.5. So the answer to this question is probability of a child to be either normal or affected is 0.5. So we have the same example of cystic fibrosis, and we're talking about mutation in the CFTR gene which causes cystic fibrosis. Its inheritance pattern is autosomal recessive, and this is like the previous example, but the difference is that in this case the cross is different. A cross is of a heterozygous individual with a person suffering from cystic fibrosis who is autosomal, who is homozygous recessive for the genotype. So previously we had the cross in which two individuals were heterozygous, or two individuals who were carriers. So, but here we have one person who is affected and the other person who is a carrier. So now what you have to do is you have to calculate the expected genotype frequency for all the possible outcomes, and then you have to calculate the individual probabilities for the normal individuals. And what is their genotype going to be? It is going to be homozygous for the dominant allele. And you have to calculate the probability for carriers, and what is their genotype? Their genotype is the heterozygous genotype. And you have to calculate the individual probability of persons affected from cystic fibrosis, and these are the individuals who are homozygous recessive in their genotype. So first thing that you have to do is calculate these genotype frequencies, expected genotype frequencies, and then on the basis of that you have to calculate the individual probabilities of the three conditions. And now these are almost the same answers that we saw in the previous example of the same type of the disease. So what is the probability that first child is normal? What is the probability that second child is carrier? What is the probability that first two children suffer from cystic fibrosis? What is the probability that second and third children are carriers? What is the probability that first child is female carrier? What is the probability that a child is either normal or affected? So these are the questions that you have to answer.